So, we have made it through this year to December and the season of Christmas cards. 40 years ago, I made my first self-made Christmas card. It started a running theme of attempting to reconnect with the root of what it is all about, stepping away from commercial obsessions while recognizing that gift giving with good heart is crucial for the giver as well as the recipient. As a child, a friend of my parents would send a variation on the round robin in the form of a beautifully crafted poem, so it was great fun to read and try to understand their code. Another underpinning theme is our version of a round robin. Each year, mostly, there has been a reference in the images to something important that has happened to us in that year, without us banging on about it. Also, this year, 2023, the Greeting Card Association in the UK has a hashtag #cardmitment initiative going on, which celebrates the impact that sending Christmas cards can have on the people who receive them. My commitment to Christmas cards has been solid, and I have only missed 1 year out of the 40, which isn't too bad. That missed year was a ghastly box of Tesco sparkly ones. The glitter still turns up in isolated corners even now. The cards represent an evolution in our card-making career as well. We started to sell cards in 2014, but as so many charities benefit from Christmas card sales, we don't do heavy promotion of them. Maybe one day we could negotiate some sort of deal with a charity, but for now we have Christmas cards for a bit of fun and playtime to cheer things up a bit. So, why send Christmas cards when charitable donations cut out the middleman or woman? Charity comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and at Christmas, focus on the individual is important. This is why it is so inspiring when people volunteer at homeless shelters, etc. Most of our cards are not sent to obviously lonely people, but sometimes you don't actually know who is feeling lonely. Showing people you care about that you are thinking of them can be a simple warm glow at a dark daylight time of year. We have had feedback from several friends over the years how much the cards they get have helped them at a stressful time. Cards also make cheerful decoration where the warm thoughts they usually contain can be reflected in the image that is on the mantelpiece. Quite often they hold on to friendships in a delicate, light touch sort of way, so that when you meet up again it isn't so awkward, because they know you still care. Over the years, fractured friendships have held on or healed thanks to that light touch a Christmas card thought can provide. My motto is, if in doubt, send it. My grandmother would make lanterns, although they weren't lit, with her pinking shears out of last year's cards, which was always very impressive. Pinking shears, staples and a bit of ribbon, and round the house they would go. Right, so, it all began in 1983. This card was the first I produced. I was volunteering in Devisers Museum cataloguing their map collection. The maps were varied and almost all wonderful, and there were cartouches galore and also some fabulous watermarks. Already rather tired of the commercialism of Christmas, this card was my exploration of the different elements that make up Christmas time as we know it in the UK. This did include marking the date of the first Christmas card sent as 1844 by W. Dobson the artist, and the central flower is the Christmas rose, and there are various other little cameo scenes from the Nativity. These cards were actually photocopied onto paper and folded into quarters, low-tech. We turned it into a tidier version for our website. Still in exploring the reasons we celebrate Christmas, this card was a traditional nativity scene that grew out of a doodle with a wax crayon. It was photocopied onto the thickest paper the photocopier could cope with, and 2 cards came off each A4 sheet. I had learned to use a scalpel by then. Work in another museum as the 1980s equivalent of an intern with more flexible contracts but minimal pay led to the shock of having to pay tax on top of rent and run a car, triggering a hit on the Christmas cards, and they reached a very low point. I had an open fire in my cottage with quince and holly growing outside. I would bake potatoes in the embers of the fire, and this triggered the idea of using potato prints to create that year's card. Each card was made individually, and I have to say that I am no fan of potato printing as a technique. I learned a lot about the choice of paper being important as well, since the paint buckled the paper I had chosen. By now I was working in Sussex University as a map curator and had access to better printing techniques. The design went back to the Christmas rose, growing on a hillside somewhere intended to be biblical. I now had access to a 4-colour copier, although clunky. I created black, green, red and blue layers that sat on top of each other brilliantly on the tracing pad. However, once handed over to the copier operator, the alignment went rather to pot. I learned quite a bit about the importance of fixing registration in mixed colour print runs. Next, a brief foray into a reflection of things that had happened during the year on a personal level, triggered by the excitement of living in the country and sharing the cottage for a short while with a band of wood mice. Talking about them conjured up ideas as to what they might get up to at their own Christmas party. I think this was another doodle that grew. After the problems of the colour printing the previous year, the colour copier had not survived, so it was back to black and white and a felt tip pen. Leaving things a bit late meant the colouring was minimal, which arguably works better than full colour might have done. The lesson learned was that sometimes less is more. This one back to the nativity inspiration for this drawing of camels and the 3 wise men following the star across the desert. This star remained a theme for several years, on and off. This was a line drawing on mixed media photocopied onto sand-coloured card to give some colour to the scene, in spite of it being a night scene. Oh well. For much of this year, we had been carrying out survey work in a sizable woodland following damage from the big storm of 1987. It involved a lot of measuring of trees and battling with holly, but also meant spending quality time in amongst the trees with the wildlife. This photocopied card was an attempt to share this experience with our friends. The green was again felt tip pen, as was the red for the hollyberries. This rather clumsy camel was an early foray into computer graphics. While working at Sussex University, I had been introduced to Apple Macs and their ability to create drawings with mixed line weights that at the time was a major shift away from the earlier pen plots that always looked like inefficient spider's scrawl. I had been drawing maps this way for a couple of years, but the camel was the first drawing, and it shows. That tone is horrible. He was inspired by a TV programme in the middle of the night while doing some college homework, as I was then training to be a landscape architect. The programme was about how the soft, gentle footpads of the camel don't break up vulnerable soils in near-desert conditions, and also about how the camel manages to provide water in its milk. The card was again photocopied from a printout. There is the saying, "Don't count your chickens until they are hatched," and it is very relevant to the card of this year. A friend was due to be married in India, and we had not only been invited to her part of the celebrations, but also to those of her husband-to-be. We were very honoured and more than a little excited. All the plans were in place, and we were to be in India over Christmas, so it was obvious that India was to be the high point of that year. Until the Ayodhya mosque was attacked and it all changed. Although the wedding went ahead, they asked us if we could not come as the country was in chaos. We went to La Palma in the Canary Islands instead, but by then the cards were made and mostly sent. We have not yet visited India. For many years, we used to spend Christmas Day on my mother's canal boat studio in Wiltshire, without mooring up, as there was no other traffic on the canal. It was calm, idyllic and good fun, as all anxieties and stresses splooshed about in the water, not inside the boat. Having no television was a bonus. The meal was created with all partaking in activities, but only one person moving about. The memories are still very special ones, and in this year our Christmas card was to reflect a sense of that tranquillity, still using the emblem of the star in the sky to remind of what the card was about. Oh, the glories of the new breed of photocopier that could manage full tonal areas, unlike those of the early 1980s that could hardly cope with text, let alone large expanses of black. This was back to a pseudo-Middle Eastern theme and a traditional interpretation of the Nativity. Looking at it now, the olive tree looks quite large, which might be intriguing psychologically. Having now visited the Holy Land, I feel quite chuffed that the character isn't too far off reality. We got a bit carried away with the felt pens, early adult colouring in, arguably. Not all worked terribly well, but it was an attempt at lifting the clunky black and white image. Changing things completely this year, we went for a bit of brass rubbing that Simon had done on a course in the autumn. We also went for a different layout in order to accommodate the width of the image. This was quite a challenge to do in bulk, which is probably why we haven't done it since. We called this one Spot the Dog on the back of the card. I had done a photography GCSE for fun that year, and it was in the pre-digital days of using darkrooms and developing films and photographs in the bathroom. My final project had been on Kipling's The Way Through the Woods and had involved taking a number of photographs of Wealden woodland. For some of the walks, I had been accompanied by a feisty little Norwich terrier called Stubbs, who loved to roam and would adopt anyone he even half knew as a walking companion. What I had not realised until developing the photograph was that Stubbs was standing expectantly while I took a series and waiting for me to return to the path and carry on walking. It was his nose that first showed on the paper as the image came to clarity. It became quite a memorable Christmas card with our friends and family. The holly scrawl at the bottom was again to be hand-coloured on the photocopied card. I think there must have been some dramatic astrophysics news this year to explain the skyscape, maybe multiple comets or something similar. The actual inspiration for the barn and the path came from an amazing trip down the west coast of Italy in a little ship called Explorer, calling into multiple smaller ports. The penultimate port was in Sicily, from where we visited the small but beautifully formed village of Erice. The cobbles in Erice were like none I have ever seen elsewhere, and they inspired this path to the barn. Production was still the trusty photocopier with its ability to cope with black tones and fairly thick paper. The skyscape's theme stuck for a further year, as did the Star of Bethlehem. As far as I can remember, this card was inspired by a trip to Corfu and a monastery path that intertwined, although not as dramatically as the overblown pretzel on the card. On the turn of the path we sat with the party and watched the bees pollinating some heather until one member announced that A, she was allergic to bee stings, and B, she had no antihistamines with her. This may be why the path was so contorted. Psychology getting involved again, maybe? This was the very first card that we did that involved a computer, our own printer, and a very active scalpel to trim the cards, as we had no guillotine. A whole new world had opened up for us, and we celebrated. The photograph was taken in Mile End in an installation called Dream Space. Music was playing evocatively as groups of people wandered around in a semi-dreamlike trance, looking down and through the tunnels of light and dark that the artist had created. When the child crossed the tasteful colours of this particular tunnel, there never was going to be a different image for the card that year. This rather sorry excuse for a drawing was inspired by a trip to Dublin and a visit to Trinity College Library and the Book of Kells. To lift it, we used the clip art that came with the printer as a frame. This also used up huge amounts of cyan ink and was not a good idea. Really wish the picture was better. The real Book of Kells is so iconic and this doesn't do it justice. The base photograph for this card was taken on a trip to Iceland, where we joined an outing to a proglacial lake and travelled around in an amphibious vehicle, getting pretty close to some amazing icebergs. It was still, eerie, and exceptionally beautiful. Father Christmas has put in an appearance in only 3 of our cards, this time pulled by dolphins. He even has a rug on his knee, which I don't remember doing. This is also the first time that I used this style of illustration, which was to feature in lecture graphics, is now in book illustrations and turned into some greeting cards. In this year, I had been learning how to do marquetry, which is amazing to do but ravages the hands from the scalpel a great deal more than slicing Christmas cards in half. We had enjoyed the film Miss Congeniality with the theme of "and world peace" running through it, and so the dove on the Christmas pudding was born. The Christmas pudding is actually supposed to be the world seen from space, but nobody caught that. Note to self, do not try to show clouds in marquetry as you can't have woolly edges. Well, you can, but not with contrasting veneers as well. Continuing the theme of world peace, this card was more than a little overly clever. We had visited France on a trip looking at cathedrals and abbeys and wanted to use a stained glass window. So we turned it into a jigsaw puzzle so we could have the piece cut out of it and have the play on words. At least we were sending people warm wishes as well. After a trip to Texas and New Mexico in the USA with new digital cameras, having digital photographs encouraged a bit more playful photoshopping. At this stage we were still camping by the inkjet printer for the hours of printing. This machine actually allowed a surface that was receptive to the ink and was thick enough to feel more like we had in mind, but golly, it was boring. The photoshopping is actually the little Christmas trees delicately placed on top of the river. This was a fun collage of photoshopped images, but actually not as many as you might at first expect. The lights and the poinsettia are the only additional elements. The ruined abbey in France was photographed through a basket-work flower bed that summer on a glorious trip, again looking at cathedrals and abbeys. A Sussex view on a misty morning, topped up with flowers at Wisley Gardens. Intriguingly, this was the year we started to get appreciative thank you letters for the cards we send out. In the autumn of this year, we had spent a wonderful week lichen hunting with friends and colleagues in Newfoundland on the Avalon Peninsula. Everything we saw was fascinating. This Aralia is a relative of ivy and was an obvious choice for a Christmas card as a result of the regular presence of ivy in our previous cards and in the Christmas tradition. Each fruit has a little photoshopped globe on it, representing wishes for world peace. We have had the huge privilege of travelling to some amazing, marvellous parts of the world. On most naturalists' lists is the archipelago of the Galapagos Islands, where we spent 3 action-packed days meeting and greeting wildlife and enjoying what is genuinely a stunning place. A surprise is how much human habitation there is with the growing population. In this year we used 2 images as the card, one of a wide open beach where there were turtle tracks crossing to the shore, and this one with a small number of our group having a chinwag, watching Sally Lightfoot crabs and the bay beyond. Several thank you letters appreciated the sunshine on the mantelpiece. In a year where we had been to the Falkland Islands, Egypt and Syria, the Christmas card was another collage bringing multiple elements together. The rockhopper penguin was bombing along after a day's fishing in the Falkland Islands. The cross was on top of a Damascus church, and the hieroglyphs were supposed to read Happy and Christmas from left to right. The holly came from Sussex. After years of slogging away at the printer, the print heads finally gave out, and so did our patience, so we opted for a Vistaprint print run. It was utter bliss to be able to sit and write the cards without having sore fingers. The Photoshop collage for this card was the flamboyant joy of the river dolphins in eastern Oman and the boat from which we watched them. This time there are more elements to the collage than it looks. The cliff, the boat, Dolphin 1, Dolphin 2 and of course Dolphin 3 were all separate photographs, once again printed by Vistaprint. The colours of the photos weren't exactly as we had in mind, but the joy of freedom from the inkjet was continuing. The seeds were being sown for expanding our horizons. Back to a nativity theme in a way after a trip to the Holy Land that May, where in the Church of the Nativity we were transfixed by the architecture projecting a sunbeam onto the altar. The effect was very moving. The church is affiliated to several denominations, in particular the Greek Orthodox Church of Jerusalem and the Armenian Apostolic Church, which explains the amazing collection of items on the altar stage. In the foreground there is a hole in the pillar where devoted celebrants insert their fingers and offer up a prayer. Many of the churches in the Holy Land contain multiple affiliates, which can be intriguing as well as confusing. Vistaprint made it a tad on the dark side, which was a shame. After years of keeping social media to a minimum, this year I finally started to learn, trial and contribute to Twitter. I've stopped since. This young blue tit had the look of someone who I had been following on Twitter, as well as being a little charmer in his own right. The tinsel was of course in Sussex, wrapped around a stick. The photoshopping was getting a bit more confident. We had labels printed to match. We didn't do that again. It was impossible to read them. And so the publishing story really begins. This image is taken from Simon Davies' first book, Silly Birding, Joining the Madding Crowd. In the end, illustrated by yours truly, published by Brambleby Books. The Christmas tree was from a previous Christmas, and the baby robin was a young pal we had made that summer called Freckles. Freckles used to practice his singing on a small branch above our heads at lunchtime, protected by a neighbour's ageing cat who couldn't pounce on him, but hated the other cats and shooed them all away. We were utterly thrilled by the book coming out and the friendship of the bird, who is now the star of his own book. After years of exotic travel with groups of others along too, we had a memorable trip to Tenerife with just us and a cantankerous hire car. The scenery was amazing. Turning it into a Christmas card seemed a bit hot and sticky until we added the rose lights we had bought to cheer up the hall in the darkness of November. We finally took the plunge away from Vistaprint and the quality of the product went right up, although there was a yellow tinge that was a surprise. Local printers can be good, but not really for greeting cards. Another publishing milestone, Antilia Publishing UK, begins. The website went live on the 18th of December. Not the best time to launch a website, but a really good date to have as a birthday, as we get to have the works Christmas meal on that date from now onwards. The first book under our imprint was It's Warmer Down Below, the autobiography of Sir Harold Harding, 1900 to 1986, my grandfather, and we were very excited. For those who we believed could cope with the semi-bragging aspect of it, we used the cover for the Christmas card, again printed by the local printer. Young Freckles made it onto this year's Christmas card, as well as being the star of Freckles and Friends. We celebrated a new world of quality printing with a partnership that has been brilliant. No more yellow casts, overly darks or bad greys, but light, bright and cheerful good work. Still local, although a different county, as they're in Kent. We had by now stopped our international travel, not by intention, but hey-ho. But we harked back to the Falkland Islands and our deeply loved penguin chums as a result of adding many of them into our card range that we call Fun and Frolics. The playfulness comes in the form of Father Christmas and Christmas hats on the beach with gentoos freshly in from surfing the crests of waves. Light is a subtext throughout Christmas and in other seasonal celebrations as well. Here Father Christmas was up and away across a montage of some blue display panels reflecting the blue light of the South Downs that we had used for our first trade show in the wrong year to have a trade show, overlaid by the most amazing sunset that we had seen over the River Severn on our way to do research on Dr. Francis Rose in the National Museum of Wales archives. Our trip this year was dominated by a visit to Scotland, and the magnificent lush graveyard of Cawdor Church allowed the superb Olympus Trip camera to do its best work on the cladonia on top of one of the tabletop tombs. We were running the British Lichen Society social media at the time, so it was very relevant from that point of view as well. Time was a bit tight, so we gambled on a different local printer, vowing to make sure we got the cards designed in better time going forwards so that we can get back to the better quality. It was, of course, quite a year in 2020, but seeds of good things were sown in amongst all the angst, and it is possible to look forward to appreciating those when they grow. They will. Isaac Newton developed his theories of gravity and invented calculus during his own lockdown from the plague, and without that, men would not have walked on the moon. This stained glass is from Street Church in Sussex. A bit by surprise this year, we published our little book called Meet the Team, about cuddly toys that act as our team members. A mild Mickey take on corporate website lingo, it is comedic. The group photo became this year's card, as why not? For mixed reasons, we have been a bit contained for a while now, so the sunshine coming in the window is really important. This little penguin chum goes by the name of Number 5, as he arrived in a Chanel box. He really does great things with refracting light. Last summer was a tad on the brief side really, but amazing while it lasted. Wandering around with the mobile phone in lunchtime sunshine, the sepals of the wild rose projected by the backlighting was very beautiful, and is an image I have remembered ever since taking it. In a time of angst we send out peaceful greetings as far and as wide as we can. Thank you very much if you have managed to get all the way to here. I hope that it has been a varied and thought-provoking collection. Wishing you all the very best for the future and hoping that somehow we see a return of common sense in this world. Thank you.